So did you know that the Buddha was a Christian saint? It's an interesting and convoluted story, and we'll be discussing it coming right up. So I'm Doug Smith. I'm study director at the Secular Buddhist Association. That's secularbuddhism.org. If you're new to the channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a less stress-filled life, consider subscribing. So it's kind of weird to think that the Buddha was, and is, in fact, a Christian saint. This is the story of Barlaam and Josaphat, which some of you may have heard. I'm going to try to go into it in a little bit more detail because the story seems to have had quite a long history. And I'm not going to get into all of it. If you're interested in reading more, I'll put some books down below in the information box. And the story begins sometime before the 8th century of the Common Era in Persia, in what's today Iran, which is nearby India, where the story is said to take place. So this is a story translated out of Middle Persian into Arabic sometime in the 8th century of the Common Era. And it's a story of King Janisar of India, who is an idolater. Now, of course, this is translated into Arabic. It's in a Muslim context, so the idolater is thought of as somebody who is certainly not Muslim, certainly somebody who is looked down upon from a different religion. And so King Janisar of India is looking to have a son. And what happens is that his wife is pregnant, and he calls the astrologers to tell him what's going, the fate of his son, whether his son's going to be a great king. And the astrologers tell the king that, I'm sorry to say that your son is going to be an ascetic, that he's going to become a great ascetic, and that he's going to become a devotee of the religion. And the religion is not described in the story, but King Janisar is said to be somebody who puts down this religion, who tries to attack it, who suppresses the religion in his territory. And so as a result, the king is despondent because, of course, he doesn't want his son to belong to this religion that he doesn't believe in, and he wants his son to be an idolater like himself. So his son is then born. The king, King Janisar, imprisons basically his son in a pleasure palace, tries to wean him away from any notion that he might become an ascetic. And of course, as we might expect, eventually the son does become a devotee of this religion and leaves his father's idolatry behind. And that's known in Arabic as the story of Bilahwar and Budasaf, because Bilahwar is the son of the king. And Budasaf is a devotee of the religion who comes to convert Bilahwar into the religion. Now, of course, we might think that the religion is Buddhism. It's not clear from the story, is the only thing. These stories, it's like a large game of telephone where Buddhism, the ideas of Buddhism become very, very interspersed with ideas of the local storytellers, where they want to sort of add their little spin on things. Then in the 9th century in Jerusalem, it's transmuted into a Christian context. In the 10th century, it's translated into Greek. And then in the 11th century, it's translated into Latin. And this becomes really a very, very influential story in Europe at the time. Throughout the Middle East, but also in Europe, it becomes a very popular story. And it makes its way in the 13th century into the Golden Legend, or the Lives of the Saints. And the Golden Legend is a 13th century medieval text that gives life stories of the saints of Christianity, and talks about their lives and their martyrdom and all that kind of thing. And so in that context, the story has transmuted now into the story of Barlaam and Josaphat. And there we have the king, an idolater king of India, who's known now as Avenir, who once again wants a son. His wife is pregnant, the queen is pregnant. He asks his astrologers to come. The astrologers tell him, your son is going to become a Christian. Now, it's not, as we remember in the last story that we heard in Arabic, it was rather that his son was going to become an ascetic and a member of the religion, which we might think is Buddhism. Here, the story is that his son is not going to become an ascetic, but he's going to become a Christian. We might say a relatively ascetic Christian, but a Christian nonetheless, because his father in India, of course, is an idolater. He prays to the gods of India, we might say. I mean, that at least is the context we might expect from the story. And so, again, his father is very displeased because his father actually persecutes Christians. And not only isn't he an idolater, but he persecutes Christians. So we take it that this story has to be sometime in the Common Era, perhaps, supposed to be the 5th century, 4th century, 3rd century of the Common Era. It's not something that would have occurred 5th century before the Common Era, before Jesus was born. So this is a story of the interaction, the conflict between Christianity and idolatry. King Avenir, again, entraps his son within a pleasure palace, trying to sort of keep his mind away from these higher ideals of Christianity and towards the ideals of the body, of sensory pleasures, and so on. And of course, as we might also expect, his son, Josaphat, eventually grows tired of these things, or at least grows concerned about them and wants to get outside this palace. His father eventually relents and lets him leave the palace, whereupon he discovers a leper and an old man. These also occur in the Arabic story, or similar kinds of things in the Arabic story, so those are transmitted along to this Christian story. And so by seeing that the leper and the old man, Josaphat learns about sickness and old age. And this, when he returns to the palace, worries him greatly. It keeps him in a state of concern, of trying to figure out what to do about this, trying to figure out what to do about sickness and old age, about eventual death, because he learns about that as well. And here again, if we're familiar with the related Buddhist story here, this story takes a different turn. Josaphat remains basically within the palace, but just in a state of, we might say, depression or angst or whatever. And at this point, there enters Barlaam. And Barlaam is a Christian monastic who's living in a land called Sennar, or Senaritus, or Serendip. Donald Lopez, who's done a lot of study of this particular history of this story, isolates that to the island of Sri Lanka, which is interesting because other places I've seen have tried to isolate this location of whatever Sennar somewhere in the Middle East. He believes it's Sri Lanka. It would be very interesting if Barlaam was supposed to come from Sri Lanka, because, of course, at the time, Sri Lanka would not have been a Christian country. It would have been a Buddhist country. But in the story, it's a Christian country. And Barlaam comes as a Christian monastic towards towards King Avenir's palace to try to convert King Avenir's son to Christianity. And he's able to do that. He meets with Josaphat and converts him to Christianity. And as the story goes, then Josaphat eventually converts his father Avenir to Christianity. They cease being idolaters, and they rule well, and eventually Josaphat takes over the throne, and eventually he abdicates the throne in order to spend his last days with his teacher Barlaam. So there's a little bit of that flavor of asceticism at the very end, where he renounces the kingdom, but only after having ruled for a long period of time. So while Barlaam or Josaphat were never officially canonized saints, they were considered saints, and Pope Sixtus V actually gave them the date of November 27th as their Saints' Day. And in the Eastern Orthodox Church, it's August 26th, which is given to Josaphat, who is the son of the King of India. I mean, so it's very, very interesting that, within various branches of the Christian Church, particular Josaphat is considered a saint. So this is, of course, a retelling of the legendary story of the Buddha's youth. The legend goes that when the Buddha was young, or I should say he wasn't the Buddha at the time, he was a bodhisattva. He was Gautama, the son of his father, who was a ruler at the time in ancient India. That the story is that his father his astrologers gave him information about the son, about what his son would be, that he would either be a great king or he would be a great ascetic. And of course, his father, not wishing him to be an ascetic, closed him up in a palace. He'd never learned about all the vicissitudes of life. He left the palace and learned about old age, sickness, and death, and also about asceticism, and then he decided to leave the palace. That is the legend of the Buddha's youth. And I've done an earlier video on this very topic, which I'll put up here on the screen, a link to it if you want to learn more about that and its sort of development or potential development. If you don't watch it now, you can wait to the end. There'll be an eye at the top of the screen if you mouse over it, and you can click on it then. Now, this story, ironically enough, of the Buddha's youth is also apocryphal. It was something that seems to have developed in the centuries after the Buddha's death. It seems to have developed from a kernel within the oldest texts, or the most, the ones that go closest back to the Buddha himself, and I talk about that in that video. But in the centuries after, this kind of legend seems to have arose perhaps first in the Jataka tales that began to be composed about the Buddha's former lifetimes, perhaps a century after the Buddha's death, but for many centuries. These stories were very popular, and they kept being either constructed or retold out of old stories that were just around in India at the time, just sort of put over into a Buddhist context. And much in the way that this story was a Buddhist story that went into a Christian context and into a Muslim context. So these stories tend to be sort of passed around if they are of literary merit, you might say. And then eventually this became part of the Buddhavamsa, which was written sometime around the 1st or 2nd century before the Common Era. And then in Ashvagosa's Buddhacharita, which is sometime in the 2nd century of the Common Era, so several centuries after that. The Buddhacharita is sort of the first complete retelling, or telling, I should say, of the Buddha's life, but it includes a large amount of legendary material, such as this story of his youth. And it's potentially true that the Buddhacharita eventually is the one that was, in some degree or another, then transmitted into Middle Persian, and then into Arabic, and then into Latin. And we have these two people then, Barlaam and Josaphat, and we might think, looking at the names, that Barlaam is supposed to be the Buddha because we have a B and so on. It sounds similar to Buddha. I won't go into the whole derivation, but basically it's Josaphat that is related to the Buddha himself. Josaphat, the word, is actually cognate to bodhisattva. Bodhisattva being a Sanskrit term meaning someone who's bound to be a Buddha, who is and it's a word used for the Buddha before he became awakened. He's called the Bodhisattva. And Bodhisattva then, that word then was imported into Arabic and then imported into Latin, and the sounds and letters changed somewhat, and it became Josaphat. Now the question is, what do we make of this strange and long sort of game of telephone over the centuries? And many of, or a certain of the scholars who deal with this material sort of take it as a grand literary irony. It's kind of ironic. Everyone seems to be taking these things so seriously, but pretty clearly it's a game of telephone. Everyone's making mistakes. It's a good story that gets transmitted with lots of extraneous material from the local cultures. Stuff gets mixed around, and you end up having a person from one religion become sainted in another religion. But I think that there are a couple of lessons that we can take about this story. They're a little deeper than that. They go a little bit further beyond the surface kind of flash of these kinds of stories. The first thing is that we can, I think if we look closely at this, find something of a kernel of at least a plausible story here of what might actually have happened. That what might actually have happened in Gautama's lifetime, in the Buddha's lifetime, before he was a Buddha, that would explain the arising of the original legend about him. And those I discussed in this prior video. I won't go into them again here. But that's one lesson we can take, is that there are ways that we can look at these things historically with some care and at least find plausible ways that they can be reconstructed. Not that we're ever going to know for sure, of course. The second bit of wisdom we can take here is something of, I think, a cautionary tale about stories like these, about philosophical ideas, about deep and complex kinds of conceptual formula being transmitted great distances between cultures. So, I mean, the story, even the story as it was in the legendary source in Buddhism, in early Buddhism, even the legend really does contain within it a great deal of dharmic importance. The importance of getting beyond sensual pleasures, of seeing the dangers in sensual pleasures. The importance of distinguishing the difference between the sensual pleasures themselves and the reality which is illness, death, that befalls all of us. I mean, I think these are the kinds of things that are important within the original story that don't get transmitted quite as well. It becomes a story more about religious conflict than one about wisdom, I think. And so the reason I say this is a cautionary tale is because there are a lot of, I think, a lot of interest nowadays among many sort of relatively scholarly Western Buddhists who are not actual scholars, let's say, but people who are interested in the scholarship, looking at ways that Buddhism and the West came together, and looking at potential evidence of Buddhism influencing ancient Greece or something like that. And there are some stories we might be able to tell there. But I think what this story tells us, or shows us, the story of Barlaam and Josaphat, is how difficult these kinds of intercultural exchanges can be. Because without a great deal of work being done to inform each culture about the other, what tends to happen instead is a lot of miscommunication, is a lot of misinformation, a lot of mistakes being made. It takes centuries of really hard work by dedicated people on both sides to be able to really overcome the initial confusions that people have with each other from different cultures. And so within the West, for example, the Buddhist texts have now been known for about 200 years. I mean, in some detail now. And it's taken, nearly that long to get to a position where scholarship is really pretty much cutting edge about what those texts actually say. And in fact, we're still doing a lot of research comparing the texts as they exist in Pali with the texts as they exist in recensions in Chinese. And that work hasn't really even been done yet completely. So these are long and difficult kinds of things. Even within Europe, when the texts of ancient Greece were lost to Europe during the Dark Ages and then retransmitted back in from their Arabic sources where they had remained and retransmitted back into Latin, it took a couple of centuries for translations to be adequate and for people to actually be able to understand what they were learning for the first time, even though it was, in a certain sense, the heritage of people who lived very close to them in ancient Greece. So these things take time. And so we should always have a certain amount of caution about them being transmitted great distances between cultures. And finally, I would say, instead of making this a tale about the conflict between religions, which it sort of morphed into in time, I think it's better to make it to understand the story of Barlaam and Josaphat as a kind of a unity of religions, or at least of thought processes, where the great founder of one religion, philosophy, became a saint within another religion. So I hope that this has been interesting to you. I would love to hear your thoughts about all this, because it's both ironic and fun and has some deep wisdom at it as well. So thanks so much for all your kind comments and questions. Thanks also for my Patreon patrons for helping out and supporting the channel. Check out Patreon if you're interested in some commentary that I'll give from time to time on things that I find on the web. And if you want to help us out, the link is right down below. And I hope to catch you all next time, because it's an ongoing journey and something we can all practice every week. So again, thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next one. Be well.